So you want to start a business and you'd like to know if it's going to make you any money. You see, a lot of people are coming to me with great ideas and they're telling me, Mike, look, I have this wonderful idea, but I would like to know, what kind of costs are involved in starting this business? What kind of revenues can we project? Are we going to make any money? Is it worth our time? And at the same time, I have a lot of guys that have just started businesses and they're saying, Mike, we budgeted for revenues, we budgeted for costs, we're 2-3 months into this business, everything is off, everything is going completely not as planned, we don't know what to do. So I thought that this to make a video which is going to be very, very useful for people who are just starting off. Before you make any big budgets and big plans on how to do it, I wanted to give you a quick back of the envelope calculation, something you can just quickly jot down to understand whether this business can make any money, that it's worth your time, and that it's even worth starting dealing with it. So while this may be a little bit more useful for businesses that have a physical presence, we're going to talk a little bit about online as well, and we're going to even do a separate video about online businesses too. But without any further ado, let's start this thing. So, of course, the main thing that we start with is revenue. Think of revenue as a big pie. 100% of your pie is your revenue. And that's what you're going to use to divide it between costs, your profit, and so on and so on. So revenue is extremely important to estimate and to budget for correctly. Now here's where most of the problems come in. When you start a business, you're super excited about it. You think that your idea or your product or your service are the best on the market. And you tend to overstate and overestimate how much people are willing to pay you for your business idea. I hear people telling me that, listen, I want to start this business because people have been telling me that they haven't seen it, that they really need it, they would love it, they would use my product, they would use my kind of service. Well, let me tell you one thing. People that are telling you they're going to use your product or your service is not the same as when they're actually paying for it. So when people tell you, I would use your product, it's not the same as them telling you, here's my money, I'm willing to pay for your product. So keep that in mind. Overestimating revenues is one of the biggest problems that people make, or one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're budgeting and trying to understand whether the business is worth their time. So don't be overly optimistic. Research, and I don't just mean, read the papers, read online what's there, go to these businesses, go to see your competitors, see how many people they have, ask around about the kind of revenue that they're making. That will help you a lot when you continue with your business plan later on. So don't be overly optimistic and know your numbers and put your revenue down as you think will actually be, not as you hope it would be, but as you realistically think that it can be. So revenue, very, very important. That's number one. So if your revenue is 100% of your pie, let's start splitting this pie up to see how much will be left over for you in the end. So let's talk about costs. Now, every business typically has two types of costs: a fixed cost and variable costs. So what's the difference? A fixed cost is a cost you're going to have regardless of the volume of business that you do. A variable cost basically depends on how much you sell. The volume of how much product you move, that's going to be your variable cost. So let's start with variable costs. See, the biggest variable cost that you have is called costs of goods sold, COGS. Now, your cost of goods sold is really the cost of the material that you're selling. If you're selling a product, it's very, very specific. It's basically the cost that this material all put together, the value of that material and how much it costs for you to make. Now, as a good margin for you to remember, the cost of goods sold for any product should be between 20 to 25% of your revenue. There are cases where you can, get away with a 30% cost, which gives you a gross margin of 70%. But in reality, you really want to be working with a 75 to 80% gross margin to cover your other expenses. So 30%, take it as the top percentage of your cost of goods sold. Of course, if you're selling your time or service is a little bit different, but for now, let's concentrate on you selling a product that you either make or you buy and you're selling it forward. So cost of goods sold, 30% of your revenue. The next biggest variable cost is actually a little tricky. The next variable cost is your labor cost. Now, your labor cost is basically the sum of all your salaries and taxes and social taxes on those salaries. Now, why I say it's tricky, because while it's a variable cost, in some way, labor also acts as a fixed cost, because while you can increase the amount of labor as the sales volume goes up, as you sell more, as you expand, you can hire more staff, and so your salaries go up as you increase. It doesn't always work the same way when your revenues go down and you need to shrink your business. You see, there's only so much you can cut. There's only so many employees you can fire before you cannot run the business. So if your revenues were to suddenly drop very hard, you couldn't always fire the necessary amount of people to keep up with that percentage of your revenue. Now, in a healthy sort of business, the cost for labor does not go above 30% of your revenue. 30% is pretty much the ceiling of what you can put on when you're dealing with labor. Now, where the problem comes, and why I'm saying it sometimes acts more like a fixed cost, if your revenues were to drop very, very hard, you can get a situation when your labor cost becomes close to 50% of your business, which is way too high. But if you have only one person working per shift, you can't fire that person, because otherwise you have to shut down or work yourself, which is sometimes a very, very wise decision. But for now, remember, labor cost, never let it go above 30%. So let's move to fixed costs. Now, probably one of the largest fixed costs you're gonna have is rent, whether you have a store, an office, whatever you need to get the job done. Never let your rent be above 10% of your revenue. Now, this is regardless whether you have a fixed rent contract or whether your rent depends on your revenue. Never sign for more than 10% of your revenue. Now, I'd like to warn you about one thing. When you sign an agreement, you usually sign an agreement for 5 years or 7 years. Do not just calculate your first year rent when you compare it to your revenue. Because in most contracts, the landlord has some sort of an option to increase rent every year based on different factors. So when you make your calculation, make sure that as your rent increases, that your revenue can keep up to not let this ratio go beyond 10% of your revenues. Very, very important. Rent, 10% of your revenue. So now that we talked a little bit about variable costs and fixed costs, let me talk to you a little bit about some of the other costs a business may have. Now, there's a cost that I like to categorize as overheads. Now, that includes your utilities, security, IT, and everyday expenses that you must make to keep the business running every day. A good ratio is 10% of your revenue. 10% of your revenue for overheads should be enough to cover all of those expenses. Second is very, it really depends on the kind of business you have, but it's still a very significant expense for a business, and that is marketing expense. Now, clearly, if your business is very heavily dependent on bringing new customers in, you're spending a lot on marketing, you will have a slightly higher figure from your revenue that you use for marketing. Then, if you have a storefront, in the middle of a very, very busy alley, and you do not need to spend so much on marketing, it'll be a little bit less of your revenue budget. But for clarity's sake, just to keep it simple, let's say that we will assign 5% of your revenue to marketing. 5% to marketing. So what does that leave us with? Let's have a look at this, 100% pie, which is your revenue, and let's deduct some of the expenses that we already talked about. So cost of goods sold, 30%, labor, 30%, we have rent, 10%, overheads and other expenses, 10%, and marketing, 5%, bringing us to a total of 85%. 85% of your pie for the cost that we just mentioned, leaving us with 15% EBITDA. Now, is 15% your profit? No. You see, if you borrowed money to start a business, as most of us have, you will need to pay interest on that. Now, that interest is taken off the EBITDA, this 15% that we had for EBITDA. Now, from here, we need to remove the interest expense, which is basically the cost of the money that you borrowed to start the business. Now, after that, we still have to remove depreciation. Now, depreciation is not really money that's leaving your pocket. This is not a cash flow expense, but it's still an expense which a business takes, which reduces the profit of the overall business. And finally, depending on where you live, there's taxes. Taxes depending on the final profit of your company. Now, if we take all of that together, now whatever is left, that's your profit. Is that money worth your time? That's really up to you to decide. You see, it depends on how big those revenues are, because as they say, you can't take percentages to the bank. You may have, a 5% net profit in the end, but it could be a very large sum depending on your revenue. Or it may not be. The fact is that if you put all those numbers together, you will get a much better picture of what kind of money you can have in your pocket at the end of the day. And really after that, it's up to you to know whether this business is worth your time. But at least you'll be making a sober decision. And remember, usually, if you're starting a business for the first time, you will always underestimate the amount of time that you need to put into your business to even get the numbers that you plan in the beginning. You could plan your revenue right, you could plan your costs right, and it all makes sense, but you may only get there 4, 5, 6, 7 months in. The first 6, 7 months, you just have to work pretty much 24/7 for your business. So when you look at those numbers, is it worth it? Well, that's for you to decide. Now, a lot of people tell me, look, we get your calculation, we sort of understand those numbers, but we think our margins are going to be higher. I've seen this happen all the time. Well, let me tell you, some of the best businesses in the world are running a 15-20% EBITDA. 15 to 20%, and they're very, very happy with it. So if you're just starting a business and you feel like you can suddenly make, over 20, 25, 30% EBITDA, that's great. That's really great if you can do that. I personally doubt it, and I'll be very, very careful with reviewing the numbers that you put in. Reviewing the revenues, have you overestimated them? Reviewing your costs, have you underestimated them? Have you underestimated the amount of time that you really, really need to put into the business to make it run? And here's the key problem. When people are often overestimating revenues and underestimating costs, you know what usually happens? Usually they're wrong about the revenues, but they're right more or less about the costs. But the problem is, when they calculated their cost and based it on a certain revenue, what happens is the revenue is half of what they predicted, but the costs are about spot on what they predicted or a little bit more. And instead of the cost being, 85% of their business, they're 110, 115, 120% of their business. And they're struggling, they're running, how can we make more revenue? How can we catch up? We cut costs as much as we could. We can't cut costs any further, and it's still over 100% of our revenue. And then they get depressed. They start hating the business that they wanted to start just 3 months earlier, and they really, really get into problems. So now I'm hoping this was useful to you. And now if you want to start a business, you're going to take these numbers, you're going to make a very, very quick budget. You do not need a complicated, business plan to figure this out. You just put those numbers, see if it works for you, and make a decision whether you want to start this business or it's a waste of your time and it's better to use your time for doing something else.